My parents threw my suitcase onto the front lawn and changed the locks while a shadowy figure watched from the window of what used to be my bedroom. Neighbours were already filming everything. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just pulled out my phone and dialed one number. 15 minutes later, a man arrived. I'm Haven Fraser. The suitcase hit the dry grass with a heavy thud under the scorching Albuquerque sun. Dust rose around it as my second bag tumbled down the adobe steps, clothes spilling onto the hot sand. My parents, Scott and Denise, stood on the porch, arms crossed, faces set, like they'd rehearsed this moment. Behind them, through the upstairs window, my window, a silhouette lingered behind the curtain, motionless. Phones were out before I even moved. Mrs. Ellis next door, the Thompsons across the street. Even quiet, Mr. Ramirez from the corner house. Everyone recording, capturing what my parents clearly thought would be my lowest point. But I stayed calm. My hand trembled slightly as I scrolled to a contact saved months ago. I hit call. The voice on the other end was steady. 15 minutes. I sat on my suitcase, right there on the lawn, and waited. Exactly 15 minutes later, a grey sedan pulled up. A man in a worn suit stepped out skin-tanned from years in the desert sun, carrying an old leather briefcase. He walked straight to me. "Haven Fraser?" he asked quietly. I nodded. He didn't say another word to me. He headed to the front door and rang the bell, 3 sharp, insistent rings. My dad yanked the door open, face red with anger. "Who the hell are you?" The man handed over a thick envelope. My dad's eyes scanned the pages. The colour drained from his face. He looked at the house, then at me. This story of family betrayal and instant karma had you hooked from the first throw. Smash that like button right now. My favourite moment was when that envelope came out and everything flipped. What was yours? Drop it in the comments below. Tell me the exact second you knew things were about to change. And subscribe so you never miss these real-life revenge stories that hit harder than fiction. I stood on the sidewalk, my office blouse still dusty from the drive home, watching as my dad dragged the second suitcase out onto the porch. He didn't carry it carefully. He just shoved it hard, letting it bounce down the 3 adobe steps and land with a scrape on the hot gravel below. Clothes poked out from the zipper, catching the harsh afternoon light. My mum stood right beside him, her voice carrying clear across the yard and into the neighbourhood. "This house is going to give Remington the stability she needs," she announced loudly, as if declaring it to the whole street. "She's young, starting her life, planning a family soon. You're grown, Haven. You can take care of yourself now." Those words hit harder than the heat rising off the ground. I glanced down at the old suitcase, the one with a fresh gouge across the side. Grandma Opal had given it to me the day I graduated college. Her hands shaky even then, as she pressed it into mine. "For all the places you'll go," she'd said with that quiet smile. I'd packed it full of hope back then. A memory flashed quick and sharp. Remington's 18th birthday. The brand new white Jeep parked in the driveway, ribbon tied around it like a gift from a magazine. My parents beaming beside her, while she hugged them. Keys dangling. My own 18th had been a homemade cake, and a promise that I'd earn my way through school. I'd taken the city bus every day, 2 transfers each way, books heavy on my lap, while Remington got rides from friends in air-conditioned cars. Another flash the summer, Remington turned 21. The family trip to Europe my parents funded completely. Paris cafes, London theatres, photos flooding social media. I'd stayed behind, picking up extra shifts at the office to cover my rent, receiving only a postcard that said, "Wish you were here," in Mum's neat handwriting. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air into a shimmering wave. Sweat trickled between my shoulder blades, but I didn't move to wipe it away. Across the fence, Mrs. Ellis appeared with a folding chair in one hand and a cold bottle of water in the other. She sat them beside me, without a word at first, then leaned in close. Opal would never have stood for this, if she was still here. She whispered, her voice low but firm eyes glancing toward the house. I took the bottle, the condensation cool against my palm, and lowered myself onto the chair. My heart raced inside my chest, but I kept my expression steady, breathing slow. No yelling, no pleading. That wasn't going to change anything now. More neighbours drifted out onto their porches. The Thompsons stood together under their Ramada, arms folded. "Mr. Ramirez leaned against his truck phone, still in hand from earlier. A few others lingered at the edge of their yards, the kind of quiet gathering that happens when something big unfolds in a small community. Whispers floated on the dry wind, too soft to make out words, but the tension hung thick. The silhouette behind the curtain upstairs shifted slightly, then disappeared. I knew whose room that was, mine since childhood, the one with the view over the yucca plants Grandma had planted decades ago. Everything about this moment felt deliberate, planned. Dad turned back toward the door, Mum following close. The lock clicked audibly as they secured it again. A final sound that echoed in the stillness. Cicadas buzzed loud from the desert scrub beyond the fence, the only noise breaking the heavy silence. I unscrewed the water bottle and took a slow sip, the cold sliding down my throat. My mind raced through years of small moments that led here the extra chores I took on as a teen, so Remington could focus on extracurriculars, the way holidays always revolved around her schedule. Once she hit high school, the quiet comments about how I was the responsible one, while she remained the baby. Mrs. Ellis lingered nearby, pretending to adjust her garden hose, but staying within earshot. A couple more chairs appeared as other neighbours settled in, not intruding, but present all the same. No one approached the porch. They just watched from their sides of the property lines. Heat radiated from the ground, making the air dance above the gravel. My shoes stuck slightly to the sidewalk as I shifted weight. The gouge on the suitcase caught the light again, a raw mark against the faded fabric. Grandma's voice echoed in my head from one of our last talks. Family isn't always fair, but you protect what's yours. I set the bottle down and rested my hands on my knees, posture straight. Whatever came next, I wouldn't give them the reaction they expected. The neighborhood held its breath with me, the cicadas droning on under the relentless New Mexico sun. The doorbell rang sharp and insistent. 3 quick bursts that cut through the heavy air. My dad yanked the door open, his face flushed dark from the heat and whatever triumph he'd felt moments ago. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, filling the doorway like he still owned every inch of it. The man in the suit didn't flinch. He simply pulled a business card from his pocket and held it out. "Lawrence Boone," he said evenly. "I represent the legal owner of this property." Dad snatched the card, eyes narrowing as he read it. Mum crowded behind him, peering over his shoulder. The man, Lawrence, stepped forward just enough to be heard by everyone on the porch and beyond. He opened a folder and began reading aloud, in a clear, professional tone that carried easily to the neighbours still watching from their yards. Recorded deed dated 2 years ago. Opal Fraser transferred full and sole ownership of this residence into an irrevocable trust. The sole beneficiary and trustee is Haven Fraser. All prior joint interests held by Scott Fraser and Denise Fraser were removed effective that date. Dad's grip on the doorframe tightened. "That's impossible," he snapped, voice rising at first, then cracking as the words sank in. He shook his head hard, like he could shake the statement away. "We've lived here for decades. This is our home." Mum echoed him, her tone disbelieving. "It can't be." Opal never said anything. Then her voice shifted, softening into something almost pleading. "There has to be some mistake. We can talk about this. Figure it out together." From inside, I heard faint movement on the stairs. Remington appeared at the landing face, growing paler with each step she took down. She stopped halfway, gripping the railing, avoiding my eyes completely. Lawrence continued without raising his voice, sticking to the essentials. "The trust is irrevocable, under New Mexico law. No amendments possible without the beneficiary's consent, which has not been given. Haven Fraser has full legal right to occupy the premises immediately." The whispers from the neighbours grew louder snippets drifting over. "Always was Opal's house," one voice murmured. Another added, "She built it with her own parents back in the day." Dad tried to interrupt again, pointing a finger. "You can't just show up," and Lawrence cut him off, calmly. "The documents are recorded with the county. Copies are available for review." He closed the folder with a soft snap. "My client may enter her property now." Mum reached out a hand toward me, as if across an invisible barrier. "Haven, honey, let's not do this out here. Come inside. We'll sort everything." Remington finally reached the bottom step, hovering near the entryway. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but nothing came out. I stood up from the chair, feeling the eyes of the entire street on us. The air felt thicker than before, charged with something shifting irreversibly. Dad's anger had drained into confusion, his shoulders sagging slightly. Mum's pleas hung unanswered. Lawrence moved aside, gesturing toward the open door. "After you, Miss Fraser." The threshold I'd crossed thousands of times suddenly felt like a line drawn in the sand. Neighbours' phones remained, pointed our way, silent witnesses to whatever came next. Dad blocked the entrance for a moment longer, staring at the papers in Lawrence's hand, as if they might change if he looked hard enough. Mum whispered his name urgently. Remington backed up a step, finally meeting my gaze for a split second before looking away again. Lawrence waited patiently, the weight of legal reality backing every second of silence. I took one step forward, then another, crossing the gravel toward the porch I'd grown up on. The adobe walls loomed familiar, yet distant now, holding secrets I'd never suspected. Dad finally moved aside, just enough for me to pass. His defiance crumbled into something quieter, uncertainty, maybe even fear. As I reached the door, the whispers from the street swelled again, a low hum underscoring the moment everything tilted. Lawrence paused for a moment, letting the legal weight settle, then continued in the same measured tone. Your grandmother acted out of concern. She suspected that plans were being made to sell this property in order to fund extended opportunities for the younger family member. My dad's jaw tightened. He glanced at Mom, then back at the lawyer. We were just thinking about Remington's future, he said defensively. A longer program abroad would give her a real advantage. Fair redistribution of assets. That's all it was. Mum stayed quiet beside him, her eyes glistening, but her lips pressed together. She didn't defend or deny. She just stared at the ground between us. Remington remained tucked slightly behind her arms, crossed tight, saying nothing at all. The late afternoon sun slanted lower, casting long shadows across the entryway and making the air feel even thicker. Heat rose from the concrete in waves, but nobody moved to escape it. A memory surfaced clear, and sudden one quiet evening a couple of years back. Grandma Opal had taken my hand after dinner and led me into her study. The room smelled of old books and her lavender soap. She'd sat me down by the small safe embedded in the wall, her fingers arthritic but steady, as she showed me the combination. Just in case, she'd said softly, not explaining more. I'd thought it was simply old age caution, a practical lesson from someone preparing for the end. Now the reason clicked into place, like the tumblers she'd taught me to listen for. Lawrence adjusted his stance slightly. Opal Fraser worked discreetly with counsel to shield this ancestral home from any such transaction. The trust structure ensures it remains protected specifically from decisions that might favour one descendant over another. Dad shifted his weight, searching for footing. She never talked to us about any of this. If she'd just said something, we could have worked it out as a family. The words sounded hollow, even to me. Family discussions in our house had always tilted one way, and Grandma had clearly seen it coming. Remington finally lifted her head a fraction, but her gaze stayed fixed somewhere past my shoulder. No protest, no questions, just silence. The lawyer nodded once. Intentions aside, the recorded instruments stand. Any further consequences stemming from unrelated financial matters will be addressed separately by the appropriate authorities. He didn't elaborate, but the implication hung there anyway. Dad's attempt at justification faded into quiet. Mum's silence deepened, her hands clasped in front of her now. Standing there on the threshold I'd paused at moments ago, everything sharpened into focus. Grandma hadn't been paranoid. She'd been deliberate, strategic in her quiet way. That safe combination wasn't random preparation. It was insurance passed only to me. The heat pressed in harder as the sun dipped, turning the sky into streaks of orange against the distant mountains. Nobody suggested going inside to talk. The porch felt like neutral ground now. Or maybe no one's ground. Dad rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding direct eye contact. We thought we were doing right by both girls, he muttered, more to himself than anyone. Mum finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. Opal always did things her own way. Remington shifted closer to the doorframe, still wordless, her usual confidence nowhere in sight. Lawrence closed his notes calmly. That's the extent of the ownership clarification. My client will take possession as she sees fit. The finality in his statement left little room for argument. Dad's shoulders dropped another inch. Mum blinked rapidly, turning her face away. I felt the shift inside me, too. Not triumph exactly, but a steady clarity, taking root. Grandma had seen the pattern long before I let myself acknowledge it. Those small preferences over years hadn't been imagination. They'd been real enough to prompt legal action from someone who'd built this home with her own hands generations ago. The desert wind picked up slightly, carrying fine sand across the steps. No one brushed it away. Dad tried one more time. There has to be some flexibility here. Family property should stay. Lawrence interrupted gently, but firmly. The law recognizes the recorded trust. Flexibility isn't part of this structure by design. Remington's breathing became audible, shallow, and quick. She leaned against the wall now, as if needing support. Mom reached out blindly toward Dad's arm, finding it and holding on. The lawyer stepped back, giving space. Remaining issues are for official channels. That ended the explanations. The porch fell completely still, except for the low hum of distant traffic on the main road. Everything Grandma had done suddenly made perfect sense. Quiet, thorough, protective, in a way only she could manage. Lawrence cleared his throat once more, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "One more detail in the trust agreement," he said calmly. "A built-in trigger activated by any unauthorized attempt to deny access to the beneficiary, such as changing the locks without permission. That step automatically forwarded a report to the Internal Revenue Service, flagging possible inconsistencies in past gift and estate tax filings." My dad's expression shifted instantly. The lingering defiance vanished, replaced by a look of genuine alarm that widened his eyes and parted his lips. He gripped the porch railing, harder knuckles turning white. Mum covered her mouth with trembling fingers, but she didn't point blame at me. Instead, she whispered almost to herself, "I only wanted to keep our family together." The lawyer pressed on, without emotion. "The IRS will now open a complete audit covering every inheritance and gift transaction related to this property for the last several years. Depending on what they uncover, penalties plus compounded interest could reach significant amounts." Remington, who had stayed frozen in place until that moment, suddenly stepped forward. Her voice came out thick and broken. "I overheard you both discussing the trust a couple months back," she confessed, eyes fixed on the ground. "You were worried about how it might affect my plans abroad. I didn't speak up because I figured staying quiet would benefit me in the end." She finally looked up at me, tears already spilling over. "Haven, please give us a little more time. I'll convince them we can still figure out a way to share everything fairly. We don't have to lose this place." I held her stare, without flinching my response. Quiet, but absolute. "It's too late for that." Remington collapsed into sobs that racked her entire body. She sank onto the top step, burying her face in her hands as the cries grew louder, echoing off the surrounding walls. Dad staggered back a step, one hand clutching his chest as if the news had physically struck him. True fear etched deep lines across his forehead. He began muttering calculations under his breath, numbers of potential back taxes, and fines he couldn't quite believe. Mum moved instinctively to Remington's side, pulling her youngest into an embrace, while her own tears started falling in silent streams down her cheeks. She rocked gently, murmuring soft comforts that sounded empty against the weight of what had just been revealed. Neighbours who had lingered at the edges of their yards began heading back inside. Porches emptied one by one, front doors closing with quiet clicks. A few kept their phones raised from farther away, still capturing the unravelling scene. But the immediate crowd dispersed. Lawrence remained standing patiently, briefcase in hand, ready for questions that never came. The full scope of federal scrutiny now loomed over everything. Years of filings reopened every transaction, scrutinized possible liens on remaining assets. Remington's crying continued, unabated, raw and desperate. She gasped between sobs, trying to form words that dissolved before they left her mouth. Dad paced the small length of the porch again, faster this time, stopping occasionally to stare at the lawyer, as if expecting a retraction. None came. Mom held tighter, her own breathing uneven. The family picture they'd clung to fractured further with each passing second. I stood, rooted in place, observing the impact spread like ripples. No satisfaction, just recognition of consequences finally arriving. Remington lifted her head briefly, mascara streaking my face for any sign of softening. Finding none, she dropped her gaze and cried harder. Dad finally spoke, voice and low. How far could they really take this? Lawrence offered no speculation. That's entirely up to their findings. Mum whispered something into Remington's hair, too soft to hear, but the younger woman's sobs only intensified. The last neighbour's porch light flicked on as dusk approached, signalling the end of public viewing. Videos would circulate privately later, but the live witnesses had gone. The lawyer glanced down at his documents once more. All formal correspondence will come through official mail. Dad stopped pacing altogether, leaning heavily against the railing as reality settled. Mum continued holding Remington, both of them shaking now. Everything they'd counted on, future plans, financial security, family unity, crumbled visibly under the new threat. I felt the shift complete, irreversible. Grandma's safeguards had layers deeper than property ownership. Remington tried again between gasps. We can still fix. The words trailed off into fresh crying. Dad rubbed his face with both hands, looking suddenly older. Mum's embrace tightened, protective but powerless. The evening breeze picked up, cooling the air slightly, but doing nothing to ease the atmosphere on the porch. Lawrence stepped back, signaling readiness to leave whenever I indicated. The breakdown played out fully. No interruptions, no quick resolutions. I watched it all without moving closer or farther away. Consequences had their own timeline, and this one ran its course without mercy. Remington eventually quieted to exhausted hiccups still cradled by Mum. Dad stared at the ground, lost in mental arithmetic he didn't like. The house waited behind me, patient and unchanged. Everything that needed to fall apart had begun. Lawrence produced a final document from his briefcase and handed it to Dad. Official notice. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. Personal clothing in effects only. No fixtures, no shared furnishings claimed as communal property. Dad took the paper with unsteady hands, scanning it quickly. Mum leaned in to read over his arm, her face draining of whatever colour remained. I stepped past them without waiting for permission, crossing the familiar threshold into the cool interior I'd been locked out of hours earlier. The door closed softly behind me, muffling the sounds from outside. The scent hit immediately dry earth from the adobe walls, mixed with the faint, lingering aroma of the strong coffee Grandma always brewed in her old percolator. It wrapped around me like a memory I hadn't realised I'd missed so sharply. My feet carried me straight down the hallway to her study, the one room that had always felt more hers than anyone's. The wooden floor creaked in the same spots it always had. I didn't pause in the living room or kitchen. There would be time for that later. The safe was still set into the wall behind her desk, hidden by a framed photo of the house in its early days. I knelt down fingers, finding the dial by touch. The combination she'd taught me years ago came back effortlessly, turned right to her wedding year, left to my birth year, right again to the day she and Grandpa bought the land. The mechanism clicked open with a soft thunk. Inside lay a single cream envelope, my name written in her careful trembling script from when the arthritis had worsened. I pulled it out and sat in her worn leather chair, the one that still held the indentation of her small frame. The paper felt heavy as I unfolded it, 3 pages filled with her handwriting that grew shakier toward the end. She didn't accuse anyone outright. Instead, she recounted ordinary moments she'd witnessed over the years. One paragraph described coming home early from a doctor's appointment and finding me in the laundry room late at night, folding work uniforms by hand because the old washer had broken again. The next day, a brand new machine appeared for Remington's dorm when she left for community college. Another section recalled evenings when I'd slip in after closing shifts at the diner, moving quietly through the dark house so I wouldn't wake anyone. She'd lie awake, listening to my tired footsteps, knowing I needed the extra hours to cover textbooks, while Remington slept soundly down the hall. Her schedule always accommodated. The hardest part came near the end, overhearing a conversation in the kitchen about securing stability for the younger one's future plans, words that made her realise the house itself might be redirected. She wrote that she couldn't bear confrontation in her final months, didn't want to spend her remaining time in arguments that would only hurt me more, so she'd chosen silence as her weapon, working through lawyers to build protections I wouldn't even know about until necessary. I needed you focused on living, she explained, not on fighting battles I could handle from afar. Tears blurred the ink as I read on. She described small joys we'd shared gardening together in spring, her teaching me to make green chili stew, the way her mother had quiet afternoons reading side by side when words weren't needed. Each memory built on the last painting, a picture of care that had always been there, steady and unwavering, even when the rest of the household dynamics shifted. By the time I reached her closing lines, this home has sheltered strong women for generations. Now it shelters you completely. The tears were falling freely onto the pages. I didn't wipe them away. All the restraint I'd held through the afternoon cracked open in that quiet room. The weight of her foresight, her sacrifice of peace in her final days to ensure mine later, it poured over me in waves. The house felt different now, not empty, but waiting as if holding its breath until the rightful occupant returned. Her presence lingered in every corner of the study, the stacked books on Southwest history, the faded photos on the walls, the faint coffee scent that refused to fade. I folded the letter carefully and pressed it to my chest, letting the sobs come without restraint for the first time, not for what happened outside, but for the love that had anticipated every hurt and built walls against it long before I knew they were needed. The light through the window shifted as evening deepened, casting long patterns across the desk. I stayed there in her chair, enveloped by the space she'd shaped and protected, feeling the full force of what she'd given me. Grandma hadn't just left a house. She'd left certainty, security, a legacy crafted specifically against the imbalances she'd quietly observed for years. When the tears finally slowed, I placed the letter back in the safe and closed it gently. The click echoed softly, sealing her words away, but not their impact. Standing up, legs steady again, I looked around the room that now belonged unquestionably to me. The protection she'd built held firm. 1 year passed quietly. My parents ended up selling the vacation cabin up near Santa Fe to cover the IRS penalties and back interest. The final bill hit harder than they'd imagined, wiping out most of their savings. They downsized to a modest 2-bedroom apartment in downtown Albuquerque, the kind with thin walls and shared laundry in the basement. No more extra spending money, no more weekend getaways. Former neighbours from our old street tended to look away when they spotted them around town. The story had spread through block parties and casual chats, turning casual acquaintances into people who suddenly had somewhere else to be. Remington never made it to Europe. The program she'd been counting on fell through without the financial backing. She took a full-time waitress position at a busy diner off Route 6A, working doubles most weekends to cover rent on a shared place with 2 roommates. For the first time, every bill landed squarely on her utilities, groceries, car insurance. No more safety net from Mum and Dad. I lived alone in the adobe house, the way it was meant to be now. I'd replaced every lock shortly after they left front door to back gate. The hallway got a fresh coat of warm terracotta paint that brightened the natural light streaming through the windows. Out front, I added several new yucca plants along the walkway, their sharp leaves catching the constant sunshine and growing strong in the dry soil. Any attempt at contact from them got shut down immediately. Phone numbers blocked, emails filtered to trash, unread social media requests denied without a second thought. No forwarded mail, no accidental run-ins. I didn't walk away from the silence. From that side became complete. Morning started with coffee on the portal, watching the desert wake up. Work days felt lighter decisions, mine alone, without second-guessing old patterns. Evenings meant cooking whatever I wanted in the kitchen Grandma had designed herself, or reading in the study where her books still lined the shelves. The neighbourhood settled into new rhythms. 2. Mrs. Ellis waved more often when watering her plants. The Thompsons invited me to their annual barbecue. No awkward questions asked. Life moved forward without the constant undercurrent of favoritism I'd grown used to ignoring. Remington's friends from high school sometimes posted photos online, her in the diner uniform, smiling tiredly after long shifts. I never liked or commented, just noted the change and kept scrolling. Dad took early retirement from his job. The stress of the audit and legal fees, too much on top of everything else. Mum picked up part-time work at a craft store, something to fill days and help with bills. Their world shrank in ways they hadn't prepared for. My own routine grew roots deeper into the house. I refinished the wooden beams in the living room, hung new curtains that let in more light. The garden expanded with native plants that needed little water, thriving in the harsh climate, just like the structure around them. Freedom tasted different than I'd expected. Not dramatic, but steady. No surprise calls demanding explanations, no guilt trips disguised as concern, just space to breathe fully for the first time. Occasional news filtered through mutual acquaintances. Remington dating someone from work, my parents celebrating a quiet anniversary in their small place. I listened politely when it came up, then changed the subject. The house itself seemed to settle to creaks and settles, sounding content rather than strained. Nights were peaceful stars, bright overhead through the skylight Grandma had insisted on installing. Independence wasn't lonely. It felt earned, solid, built on the foundation she'd quietly secured. Some days I walked the property line, checking the new plants, feeling the dry breeze carry away any lingering what-ifs. The cutoff remained absolute. No birthdays acknowledged, no holidays shared. The boundary held firm. Life continued in its new shape. Simpler finances for them, complete autonomy for me. The desert kept its secrets, and so did I. I stood in the front yard as the desert sunset painted the sky in deep reds and oranges, watering the row of new cacti I'd planted along the path. Their spines caught the last light, sharp and resilient against the dry air. The long shadows of the yucca plants stretched across the warm adobe walls, softening the edges of the house that had stood here for generations. I finished with the hose, coiled it neatly, and walked to the iron gate at the edge of the property. My hand closed around the lock, turning it firmly until the click echoed in the quiet evening. The wind moved through the open land beyond, carrying fine grains of sand that whispered against the metal. This house remained solid in the harsh New Mexico landscape, having watched women before me navigate hardship and emerge on their own terms. It held stories in its thick walls, resilience passed down without fanfare. I no longer glanced backward at what had been. Forgiveness wasn't something I offered, and the door stayed closed to anyone trying to return from that chapter. Life continued here, on terms entirely my own, in the space Grandma had quietly secured for exactly this purpose. Complete freedom from expectations that never served me. Everything resolved into that simple reality. No more negotiations, no lingering ties, just the vast silence of the desert stretching out unbroken and indifferent. The lock's final turn marked the end of any possibility for reopening old wounds. I stepped back inside, pulling the gate shut behind me. Stars began appearing overhead as night settled. The house enveloped me in its familiar quiet, a sanctuary built and protected across decades. What Grandma gave wasn't just property. It was permission to choose my boundaries without apology, to build a life unburdened by favoritism or guilt. Some ties once severed stay that way. The peace in accepting that proved deeper than any forced reconciliation could offer. I moved through the rooms, turning off lights, one by one. The structure creaked softly in the cooling night content in its purpose. Outside, the wind kept moving, carrying away anything that no longer belonged. Independence felt like this, rooted firmly open to the horizon, closed to what tried to diminish it. The desert taught endurance. Grandma taught protection. Together they left me with clarity. No need for words, no room for regret. The silence wrapped around everything, complete and unyielding. In the end, that's what remained. The quiet strength of standing alone when necessary, carrying forward only what truly mattered. The night air cooled quickly, as it always did in the high desert. I paused at the window, overlooking the yard, watching the cacti settle into darkness. Their shapes became silhouettes against the star-filled sky, reminders of how life thrives in tough conditions with the right foundation. I drew the curtains sealing the view, but not the feeling. The house breathed with me, its adobe walls, holding warmth from the day long after the sun vanished. Every corner now reflected choices I'd made since taking full possession. Simple furniture, rearrangements, books placed where I wanted them, no compromises for others' preferences. Sleep came easily these nights, untroubled by unanswered messages or unexpected knocks. Mornings brought the same reliable light filtering through the vigors, starting days that belonged solely to my rhythm. The realization grew over time. True security wasn't in numbers or shared history, but in knowing no one could take this away again. Grandma's foresight had created that unbreakable core. I walked the hallway one last time before bed, fingertips brushing the freshly painted surfaces that no longer carried traces of past arguments. The air smelled clean of earth and possibility. Outside, coyotes called in the distance, their voices carrying across the empty land. I listened without fear, part of the landscape now. The gate lock held strong, a small but symbolic barrier. No invitations extended, no openings left. The freedom tasted clean, like the crisp night air after a rare rain. Stars wheeled overhead, indifferent witnesses to human dramas below. The house stood as it always had, enduring silent mine. That was enough, more than enough. The wind died down eventually, leaving only stillness. I turned off the final light, letting darkness claim the interior. Tomorrow would bring its own light, its own quiet, and I would meet it on my terms, as Grandma intended. The desert kept its peace, and so did